The roll of film came in colors: red, yellow, white, midnight blue. You unspooled it across the wing, ran the iron over it, and watched it shrink tight, smooth and taut and perfect, in under a minute. No brush, no dope, no waiting overnight for tissue paper to dry. Just heat and plastic, and a wing that looked like it came out of a factory. For 30 years, Monokote was on more RC airplanes than anything else in America. If you built during the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, you used it. You probably still remember the smell. It's gone now. Not because the market rejected it, not because something better came along. It was discontinued by the company that bought the brand, because that company already had a competing product and saw no reason to run both. One meeting, one line item, gone. Top Flite still exists. The name is still on a website. You can still find it on a search engine, but the kits are gone. The film is gone. The Chicago factory is gone. And the man who invented the material that made it all possible has been largely forgotten outside the people who still remember what a sealing iron felt like in their hands on a Saturday afternoon. This is the story of what Top Flite actually was, and what it means that the name survived while everything else didn't. Chicago in 1945 was a city that built things. It built steel, and it built meat, and it built furniture, and it built ambition. And in the back rooms of hobby shops on the north side and the south side both, it built model airplanes. The men who came back from the war came back with their hands still looking for something to do. Some of them found it in garages, some found it in basement workshops. A few found it in a small company on South Wabash Avenue that was just getting started, making wooden propellers and balsa kits for a hobby that most of America had not yet discovered. Top Flite models began in that post-war moment, that specific window of American history when men who had spent years maintaining aircraft engines, loading bomb bays, and reading wind instruments came home and looked for a way to keep the feeling without keeping the war. Model aviation gave them that. It was precise, it was technical, it rewarded patience and punished shortcuts. It felt in some small way like the real thing. Sidney Axelrod understood this. He was not a romantic about it. He was a businessman, and he understood that for a hobby to grow, it needed better tools than what existed. The kits of the early post-war era were difficult. The covering materials were worse. Tissue paper soaked in nitrate dope was the standard. You brushed it on in layers, waited for each coat to dry, prayed the humidity would cooperate, and ended up with a finish that was uneven at best and warped at worst. It was a process that rewarded experts and discouraged everyone else. Axelrod saw the barrier clearly. He spent years thinking about how to remove it. But that came later. In the beginning, Top Flite built its reputation on something simpler: precision. The propellers the company produced in its early years were machined to tolerances that the hobby market had not seen before. When a modeler picked up a Top Flite prop, he could feel the difference before he ever mounted it on a shaft. That reputation traveled through AMA club meetings, through hobby shop counters, through the letters column of Model Aviation magazine. And by the time the 1950s arrived, Top Flite was a name that meant something in the circles where names like that mattered. The Jig Time series was a different kind of statement. Designed with Carl Goldberg before his departure to start his own company, the kits were built around a radical idea for the time, that a beginner should be able to succeed. The balsa parts were pre-colored. The tabs and slots were engineered so that each piece could only fit one way. The box guaranteed the model would fly. It was an act of confidence in the product and an act of respect for the customer, two things that were not always the same thing in the hobby industry. It was also a signal about what Top Flite believed the hobby could become. Not a closed community of experts who gate-kept the knowledge, something wider, something that a 12-year-old with $5 and a Saturday afternoon could enter and find success in. In 1964, a young British designer named Dave Platt was working as a consultant in London when he found himself with 2 job offers from 2 Chicago companies. Carl Goldberg had invited him over, so had Sidney Axelrod. The difference, Axelrod told him, was this: if you work for Carl, you will be a draftsman. If you work for me, you will be a designer. Platt chose Top Flite. It was not a difficult decision. Axelrod had a way of making clear what he thought the work was worth, and what he thought the people doing it were worth. That instinct, to see the talent in front of him and give it room to become what it could be, was as much a part of how Top Flite grew as any single product the company ever made. The men who worked there in those years did not talk about it as a job. They talked about it the way people talk about a place that gave them permission to care about what they were doing. For a long time, in the city that built things, that was enough, more than enough. By the 1970s, Top Flite was not just a company, it was a standard. Walk into any serious hobby shop between Chicago and Los Angeles and you would find it on the shelves. The flat boxes with the technical illustrations on the covers, the die-cut balsa sheets nested inside like a puzzle waiting to be solved, the hardware bags with every clevis and pushrod and control horn counted out and bagged separately. Nothing was missing, nothing was approximate. The plans were drawn to a precision that let a builder trust them, full size, clean, every dimension confirmed against every other dimension. You did not have to wonder whether the designer had actually built the thing he was selling you. With Top Flite, it was obvious that someone had. The factory on Narragansett Avenue ran on that standard. The people who worked there understood that the product they were putting together was going to end up on a workbench somewhere, in a garage in Ohio, a basement in Pennsylvania, a spare bedroom in Texas, and that the man opening the box was going to spend 200 hours with what was inside it. That knowledge shaped how the work was done. A miscut part was not a production statistic. It was 200 hours of someone's time that you had just disrespected. Outside the kits, there was Monokote. Sidney Axelrod had been watching the covering problem for years. The standard solution, tissue paper applied with nitrate or butyrate dope, was labor-intensive, inconsistent, and deeply unfriendly to anyone who had not already spent years learning to do it right. The dope had to go on in multiple coats. Each coat had to dry completely. The tissue wrinkled if the humidity was wrong. The finish sagged if the structure underneath was not perfect. It was a process that added days to a build and introduced failure modes that had nothing to do with the quality of the kit itself. Axelrod looked at the mylar film that draftsmen used in their offices. Thin, dimensionally stable, heat-responsive, and saw something that nobody else in the hobby industry had seen yet. He adapted the material, developed a heat-activated adhesive formulation, and filed the patent in 1966. U.S. Patent 3,188,051. The product that came out of that work was Monokote, a single-step covering film that you cut to size, laid over the structure, and shrunk tight with a sealing iron. No brush, no dope, no weighting. The adhesive activated with heat and bonded to the wood. The film shrank taut and smooth. The whole process that had previously taken days now took hours. The hobby shop display told the story better than any advertisement could. The rolls of Monokote stood upright in their bins, red, white, yellow, blue, black, transparent, metallic, and they caught the light in a way that tissue paper never had. You could see what the finished airplane would look like before you ever started building. That visibility was part of the product. Axelrod understood that the covering was not just a structural necessity. It was the moment the model became real. By the 1980s, Monokote was on more RC airplanes than any other covering material in the country. It was not a regional preference or a hobbyist quirk. It was the industry default, the thing you used unless you had a specific reason not to. Clubs flew it. Contest pilots trusted it. Beginners learned on it. The rolls with the Top Flite logo became as familiar a sight in a hobby shop as the cash register itself. Dave Platt, working as Top Flite's lead designer through those years, was producing some of the most respected plans in the RC world. The Orion, the contest-capable pattern ships that serious pilots flew at regional and national competitions. Models that were not designed to be easy, they were designed to be right. To fly the way a well-built airplane should fly, responsive and honest, and without the small evasions that cheaper kits built into their geometry to compensate for builder error. The Gold Edition Warbirds came later, larger, more detailed, more demanding, and they brought a different kind of hobbyist to the brand. Men who had the patience to spend 6 months on a single model. Men who wanted the finished airplane to be something they could look at and feel had been worth the time. Top Flite made kits for those men, and those men made Top Flite into something that outlasted the specific decades that produced them. At its peak, the brand carried a kind of cultural authority that is difficult to explain to anyone who was not inside the hobby during those years. It was not nostalgia because the people who felt it were not looking backward. They were in the middle of it, buying the kits and rolling out the Monokote and adjusting the trim on Sunday mornings at the flying field. It was the authority of a thing that had earned its place by being consistently, reliably, undeniably good. None of them knew it would not last. That is always how it goes with things that feel permanent. The orders were still coming in, the hobby shops were still stocking the shelves, but somewhere beyond the Narragansett Avenue address, forces were already in motion that Top Flite had not built itself to withstand. The first sign was not a collapse. It never is. It was a question that hobby shop owners started asking each other sometime in the early 1980s, quietly, at trade shows and regional distributor meetings. Who is the next generation of builder? The men who had grown up with balsa and tissue in the 1950s were now in their 40s. Their sons had grown up with video games and plastic snap-together kits that required no tools and no patience and produced a finished object in 45 minutes. The hobby that had shaped a generation of American men, the Saturday discipline of cutting and sanding and covering and trimming, was not disappearing exactly, but it was not growing the way it once had. The pipeline of new builders that every company in the industry depended on was narrowing. and the narrowing was slow enough that it was easy to explain away in any given year. A bad economy, a slow season, competition from other hobbies. There was always a reason that was not the real reason. The real reason was structural. Building a traditional balsa kit required an investment of time that the culture was no longer organized to support. 200 hours was a commitment that assumed a particular kind of life. Evenings free, weekends unscheduled, a workshop that was yours and not shared with a growing family. The men who had that life were aging. The men who were replacing them, broadly speaking, did not. From Asia, a different kind of product was beginning to arrive. Almost ready to fly, ARF, aircraft that came pre-built, pre-covered, requiring only final assembly and radio installation before they were airborne. The workmanship was not what Top Flite produced. The materials were not comparable. But the barrier to entry was radically lower, and in a hobby whose customer base was aging and whose replacement rate was slowing, lower barriers mattered more than they once had. A man with a free Saturday afternoon could buy an ARF, put it together in a few hours, and be at the flying field the same weekend. The same man with a Top Flite Gold Edition kit was looking at a 6-month commitment before his airplane left the ground. Top Flite's response to this was not irrational. The company had built its identity on quality and precision, and the particular satisfaction of a long build completed well. To abandon that identity to chase a market segment defined by speed and convenience would have felt, to the people inside the company, like a betrayal of everything that made the brand worth having. And they were not entirely wrong. The customers who bought Top Flite kits were loyal in a way that ARF customers were not. They came back, they bought the next kit, and the one after that. They were not price sensitive in the way the mass market was. The argument for staying the course was coherent. But coherent is not the same as correct. Then came the acquisition. Sometime in the late 1980s, the precise year is not a matter of clean public record. Hobbyco purchased Top Flite models. Hobbyco, based in Champaign, Illinois, was building itself into the dominant distribution and manufacturing entity in the American hobby industry. It already operated Tower Hobbies, the mail-order catalog business that had become the primary retail channel for RC products across the country. Adding Top Flite gave it a premium manufacturing brand to sit alongside its distribution infrastructure. On paper, the logic was sound. Top Flite gained the resources of a larger organization. Hobbyco gained a brand with 40 years of earned credibility. What changed was harder to see from the outside. Top Flite was no longer a company making decisions about its own future. It was a brand within a portfolio, one of 30 proprietary labels that Hobbyco would eventually accumulate. The men who had built the kits and developed the plans and formulated the covering film no longer controlled what happened next. That control had moved south, to Champaign, to a corporate structure that measured Top Flite against every other asset it owned and made decisions accordingly. The catalog did not change overnight. The kits that had made the brand's reputation were still there. The Orion, the Gold Edition Warbirds, the pattern ships. Monokote was still on the shelves in every color the company had ever produced. To a hobbyist walking into a shop in 1992 or 1995, Top Flite looked exactly like Top Flite had always looked. But the decisions about what came next, what new kits would be developed, what materials would be invested in, what the brand would become in the decade ahead, those decisions were being made by people whose primary obligation was to a balance sheet that included 30 other brands besides this one. They called it growth. They called it stability. They called it the natural evolution of a maturing industry. It was not temporary, and the real damage had not announced itself yet. Hobbyco in the 2000s was an empire by any reasonable definition of the word. It distributed over the 150 brands. It operated Tower Hobbies, the catalog business that had become the dominant retail channel for RC products in North America. It owned Great Plains, Revell, Monogram, Carl Goldberg Products, Estes Industries, and dozens of smaller labels that filled every corner of the hobby market from plastic model kits to drone components. The corporate headquarters in Champaign, Illinois employed hundreds of people. The warehouses moved millions of units. By the time the 2010s arrived, Hobbyco was not just a hobby company. It was the infrastructure through which most of the American hobby industry operated. Top Flite was inside that infrastructure, technically present, cataloged and distributed and accounted for. But the brand that had once been a single-minded expression of one man's commitment to precision had become a line item among hundreds. New kit development had slowed to a pace that longtime customers noticed. Forums began filling with a specific kind of complaint, not angry exactly, but resigned. Men who had been buying Top Flite kits for 30 years observed that they had been looking at the same catalog for what felt like 2 decades. The Orion was still there. The Gold Edition Piper Arrow was still there. The Warbirds were still there. Nothing new had arrived to join them. This was not an accident. It was the logical output of a portfolio management approach that allocated development resources across 30 brands based on projected return. Traditional Balsa kit production required skilled designers, precision tooling, and a customer base willing to invest months of labor in a single product. The ARF market required none of those things and served a larger and faster-growing segment. Inside a corporation managing 150 brands, the math was not complicated. The hobbyists who had grown up on top flight kits watched this and understood, even if they did not say it plainly, what it meant. A brand that stops developing new products is a brand that has decided its existing customers are its last customers. It is a form of managed decline dressed in the language of legacy. Meanwhile, Hobbyco itself was under pressures that had nothing to do with any individual brand. The rise of online retail was restructuring the hobby distribution business in ways that the Tower Hobbies catalog model was not built to absorb. The drone and quadcopter market was attracting a new generation of hobbyists who had no connection to balsa wood or glow engines or the flying field culture that had sustained the RC airplane community for decades. The company was carrying debt from its years of acquisition, and it was operating in a consumer market that was fragmenting faster than any single distribution infrastructure could follow. On January 10, 2018, Hobbyco filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing listed approximately 850 employees worldwide. It listed assets and liabilities and creditor obligations in the dry language that bankruptcy documents require. And buried within the schedule of proprietary brands, the intellectual property that represented the accumulated identity of decades of American hobby manufacturing, were two names that had begun in the same Chicago building in 1945, Top Flite and Carl Goldberg Products. They had separated in 1955 when Carl Goldberg left to build his own company. They had competed across 50 years, different philosophies, different product lines, different customer loyalties, while remaining in the estimation of the serious hobbyist, the twin pillars of Chicago RC aviation. And now they appeared together again, not in a catalog or at a flying field, but in a federal bankruptcy filing in the Central District of Illinois. Two companies that had spent half a century as rivals ended their independent existence on the same page of the same legal document. The RC community followed the proceedings with the specific anxiety of people who understand that the outcome will affect something they love. Forums ran daily threads tracking the auction process. Collectors began buying remaining kit stock. Hobby shop owners called their distributors looking for information that nobody had yet. The question was not whether Hobbyco would survive. Chapter 11 made clear it would not, at least not in its existing form. The question was which brands would find buyers and what those buyers would do with them. By the end of that winter, the only question left was who would be standing when it was over, and whether standing would mean anything at all. April 13, 2018, Horizon Hobby placed the winning bid for Hobbyco's radio control assets. The price was $18.8 million. It was, as far as public records showed, the only bid. Horizon Hobby was based in Champaign, Illinois, the same city as Hobbyco, a fact that carried its own particular irony. The two companies had been founded in the same year, 1985, in the same town, by people who knew each other and competed against each other for 3 decades. Horizon had built its business on a different model than Hobbyco. It had focused on ARF aircraft and electric power systems and the newer segments of the RC market rather than on traditional kit manufacturing and broad distribution. Where Hobbyco had expanded horizontally, accumulating brands and distribution channels, Horizon had gone deep into the products it understood and the customers it was already serving. Now Horizon owned Top Flite. It owned the name. It owned the intellectual property. It owned the designs that Dave Platt and the other Top Flite designers had developed across 4 decades. It owned the Monokote trademark. It owned the Gold Edition Warbird plans and the Orion geometry and the full hardware pack specifications that had made the brand's kits the standard against which other kits were measured. What it did not own, what could not be transferred in a bankruptcy auction, was the institutional knowledge of the people who had made those products. The designers who understood how a Top Flite kit was supposed to feel when a builder opened the box. The production staff who knew what tolerance was acceptable and what was not. The culture of precision that Axelrod had built into the company from the first propeller it ever shipped. That was gone before the gavel came down. It had been going for years. The hobbyist community watched and waited. Some were cautiously hopeful. Horizon was a real company with real resources, and a brand as recognized as Top Flite was worth protecting. A hobby dealer in the Midwest put it plainly in the weeks after the acquisition. Top Flite is too iconic to kill, but he followed it with something that was harder to dismiss. I'm not sure how relevant they are these days. That tension, iconic but irrelevant, recognized but no longer necessary, was the exact condition that defined what Top Flite had become inside the Hobbyco years. The name had outlasted the momentum. The reputation had outlasted the development. And now the name had passed to a new owner who had built its entire business on the proposition that the future of RC aviation did not require anyone to spend 6 months building a Balsa kit. The answer to what Horizon would do with Top Flite was already implicit in everything Horizon had ever been. Nobody said it out loud that spring, but the people who had been paying attention for long enough already knew. The website went up under the Horizon Hobby domain. The Top Flite logo was there, the name was there. If you searched for Top Flite in the months after the acquisition, you found a page that looked like a brand page. Clean, organized, professional. To someone who had not been following the hobby industry closely, it might have appeared that nothing had changed, that Top Flite had simply found a new home and was continuing on. What was not on the page told the real story. The Balsa kit catalog was not there. The Gold Edition Warbirds were not listed for sale. The Orion was not available. The pattern ships that Dave Platt had designed across 4 decades of work at the company, gone. Horizon Hobby had never been a kit company. It had built its business on ARF aircraft and electric power systems and ready-to-fly products that required assembly measured in hours rather than months. There was no infrastructure inside Horizon to support traditional kit production. No design staff oriented toward it, no supply chain built around die-cut balsa and full hardware packs and hand-drawn plan sheets. The kits had not been discontinued with an announcement. They had simply not appeared, which is a different thing, and in some ways a quieter and more complete erasure. Then Monokote disappeared. Not immediately. For a period after the acquisition, existing stock remained available through Horizon's retail channels. Hobbyists who knew what was coming bought rolls in quantities that would have seemed excessive in any previous decade. Cases of red, cases of white, colors they might not use for years stored in climate-controlled spaces because they understood that replacement was not coming. The forums documented this in real time. Threads appeared tracking which colors were still in stock at which retailers. Men who had been covering wings with Monokote since the 1970s described the experience of watching the inventory drain in language that was more appropriate to a vigil than a shopping transaction. The reason for the discontinuation was not complicated. Horizon Hobby already owned Ultracote, a covering film produced under the Oracover brand, European in origin, well-regarded in the market, and fully integrated into Horizon's existing product ecosystem. Running 2 competing covering films made no business sense. Monokote and Ultracote occupied the same shelf position, served the same function, and appealed to the same customer. One of them had to go. The decision was rational by every metric a product manager would apply to it. What the product manager's metrics did not capture was that Monokote was not simply a covering film. It was the material object most closely associated with 40 years of American RC aviation. It was the thing you reached for at the hobby shop when you were 16 years old and building your first serious model. It was the smell of Saturday afternoons in a garage. It was the specific sound of the sealing iron moving across a wing panel, the film tightening behind it, the wood grain disappearing under a surface so smooth it looked factory-made. These were not features that appeared in a product comparison spreadsheet. They were the texture of a hobby culture that had been built around specific materials used in specific ways by specific generations of American men. When Monokote went, something went with it that the brand name alone could not carry. Sidney Axelrod had filed the patent in 1966. The document still exists in the USPTO records. U.S. Patent 388051, assigned to Top Flite Models Inc. South, describing a heat-shrinkable polyester film with a heat-activated adhesive designed for covering model aircraft structures. The patent itself expired long ago, as patents do. The trademark on the Monokote name passed through Hobbyco to Horizon and was discontinued there. The manufacturing had been handled by General Formulations of Sparta, Michigan, a company that made the film to Top Flite's specifications and could, in theory, make it again for someone willing to order it. No one has. Axelrod's invention survived longer than most things survive. Nearly 6 decades from the moment he looked at a draftsman's mylar roll and understood what it could become to the day the last retail stock was sold and the product ceased to exist. That is not a short run. By the standards of American manufacturing history, it is a remarkable one. But remarkable runs end, and when they end without ceremony, without a final catalog, without a closing announcement, without anyone standing in a parking lot at the end of a last shift, the ending has a particular quality to it. It does not feel like a conclusion. It feels like an interruption. The Top Flite name remained on the Horizon website. Accessories were available: sealing irons, covering tools, replacement hardware. The infrastructure of the hobby was still there, in reduced form, for the people who still needed it. But the kits that had defined the brand were gone, and the film that had made the brand indispensable was gone. And what remained was a name attached to a category of products that the company now owning that name had no particular intention of expanding. A hobby dealer who had carried Top Flite products for 20 years described it in terms that required no elaboration. The name is there because the name has value. What the name means is a different question. That is the specific condition of a Type C ending. Not closure, not transformation. The name survives and the identity does not. And the gap between them is where everything that mattered used to live. There is a listing on eBay right now. There has been one continuously since sometime in 2018 for a 6-foot roll of Top Flite Monokote in Cub Yellow. The asking price is $75. The roll originally sold for less than $10. The seller describes it as new old stock, still in the original packaging, stored properly. In the question section, someone has asked whether it is genuine Top Flite or a reproduction. The answer is that it is genuine. There are no reproductions. Nobody is making reproductions. The only Monokote left in the world is the Monokote that was already in the world before Horizon Hobby discontinued it, and it is moving slowly from the shelves of hobbyists who are thinning their collections to the shelves of hobbyists who are not ready to stop building. That transfer of old stock between aging hands is what the aftermath of Top Flite looks like in practice. Not a museum, not a revival. A secondary market sustained by scarcity and by the specific reluctance of a generation of builders to accept that the material they learned on is simply no longer available. The address on Narragansett Avenue in Chicago where Top Flite once operated is not a hobby company anymore. The South Wabash address where the company began in 1945 is not a hobby company either. Chicago itself has not been a center of RC aviation manufacturing for decades. The hobby moved, first into the hands of Midwestern distributors, then into the portfolios of corporate consolidators, then into the supply chains of overseas manufacturers who could produce ARF aircraft at prices no American company could compete with. The city that built the best model airplanes in post-war America built its last ones quietly, without announcement. And the buildings that housed that work have been repurposed into things that have nothing to do with balsa wood or heat-activated adhesive, or the particular satisfaction of a wing covered smooth on the first try. Horizon Hobby still carries the Top Flite name in its brand portfolio. The Champaign, Illinois headquarters, the same city where Hobbyco ran its operations, continues to operate. If you visit the Horizon website and navigate to the Top Flite section, you will find covering tools and replacement parts and accessories for a building tradition that Horizon itself does not support with new kits. It is the retail equivalent of maintaining a shrine. The candles are still lit. The room is empty. Dave Platt, the British designer who chose Top Flite over Carl Goldberg in 1964 because Sidney Axelrod promised him he would be a designer and not a draftsman, spent decades producing some of the most respected plans in American RC aviation. The models he designed are still being built from original kits by collectors who bought them years ago and stored them carefully against the day they would have the time and the space to do the work properly. Those kits are not being replaced when they are gone. The plans exist in digital form somewhere inside Horizon's IP portfolio, on a server in Champaign, attributed to a brand that no longer produces the products those plans describe. Sidney Axelrod's patent, US 388051, expired long ago, as all patents do. The invention it described changed the way an entire generation of Americans built model aircraft and created a material so closely identified with the hobby that its name became generic in the way that only the most successful products achieve. People called every heat shrink covering film Monokote, the way they called every adhesive bandage a Band-Aid. That kind of linguistic absorption is not given to many products. It is a form of cultural permanence that outlasts the product itself. And it outlasted Monokote by the specific measure that people still use the name for a thing that no longer exists under that name. What remains in the end is what always remains when a brand reaches a Type C conclusion. The name on a website. The old kits in climate-controlled garages, their boxes still taped shut, their balsa sheets still nested inside the die-cut frames, waiting for a builder with enough patience and enough time. The rolls of Monokote in their original packaging, trading hands on eBay at 8 times their original retail price, because the people who remember what they felt like to use are not finished remembering. Somewhere in Illinois or Ohio or Wisconsin, a man in his 60s is opening a garage on a Saturday morning. Inside, on a shelf above the workbench, is a Top Flite Gold Edition kit he bought in 1994 and never built. The box is intact. The plan sheet is folded inside exactly as it came from the factory. There is a roll of Monokote next to it, red, because the model called for red, that he has been saving since he heard the news in 2018. He is not sure he will ever build it, but he has not thrown it away. And on Saturday mornings, when the light comes in right, he looks at it the way you look at something you know you will not see again. He knows what it was. He knows what it meant. And he knows that the name on the Horizon website, clean, searchable, professionally maintained, is not the same thing as what he is looking at on that shelf. It never will be.